Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, my name is Mathias Rambaud and I run the book department here at the French Institute. We are delighted to host you today as part of the Beyond Worlds Festival for a great evening dedicated to the 150th anniversary of Colette's birth. To discuss the work and life of this wonderfully free and clever artist, we are honored to welcome 4 friends of the French Institute. Deborah Levy is an accomplished author with an innovative trilogy of books, Things I Don't Want to Know, The Cost of Living, and Real Estate. Shortlisted twice each for the Goldsmith Prize and Booker Prize, she won the Prix Féminin Étranger in 2020. Deborah has also written for the Royal Shakespeare Company and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Her latest works include August Blue, a truly amazing novel I can only recommend, and La Position de la Cuillère, translated by Nathalie Azoulay for Éditions du Sous-Sol, a collection of essays specially written for the French readership, among which Deborah has kindly agreed to read the one dedicated to Colette tonight. Michèle Roberts is Emeritus Professor of Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia and the author of 14 highly acclaimed novels, including The Looking Glass and Daughters of the House, which won the W.H. Smith Literary Award and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Her latest novel, Cut Out, is about the young women assistants who helped Matisse with his cutouts. Emmanuelle Lambert is the author of several novels, La Désertion, Le Garçon de mon père, and the literary essay Giorno Furioso, published by Gallimard in 2020. The latter won the Femina Prize for Essay in 2019. Acknowledged by the art community, she curated the Genet and Giorno exhibitions at the Museum and participated in the edition of Jean Genet's novels and poems in the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade. Her latest book is about Colette, and it's called Sidonie, Gabrielle, Colette, published by Gallimard in 2022. The three of them will be in discussion with Diana Holmes, who is Professor of French at the University of Leeds and the author of many books and articles on French women's writing, from highbrow to popular. These include Colette, Macmillan Women's Writers Series, and her latest Middleborough Matters, Women's Reading and the Literary Canon in France since the Belle Époque. And I shall mention that for her accomplishment in the field of culture, Diana was awarded the insignia of Chevalier des Arts et Lettres by the French ambassador, Hélène Duchesne, not later than today in his very library. Tonight there will be some readings by Olivia Ross. Olivia is a British actress born in Paris. She started a career at the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre and has since performed in award-winning shows such as Killing Eve and War and Peace. And in France, she has an extended career working in auteur cinéma with award-winning directors such as Olivier Assayas, Mia Hansen-Løve, and Benoît Jacquot. Copies of our guest books, both in English and in French translation, when possible, are available downstairs thanks to our partner South Kensington Bookshop and La Page. And before I hand over to Diana to start the discussion, allow me to mention that right after this event, we are very excited to host French philosopher Paul Preciado, who will be in conversation about Virginia Woolf's Orlando with literary critic Merve Emre. So if you don't have plans, please do join us on this occasion. And if you had plans, do cancel them immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. So we're here to discuss the work of Colette. We're going to cover lots of different aspects of that, we hope, and we'll try to leave some time for questions from the audience too. But to start off, we're going to ask Olivia to read a passage from Colette's La Naissance du Jour in French and in English, just to start things off with a flavour of Colette's own voice. After that, we'll ask Deborah to read from her passage about Colette and her own reactions to Colette, and then we'll launch discussion between all of us. Olivia, merci.
Une des grandes banalités de l'existence, l'amour, se retire de la mienne. L'instinct maternel est une autre grande banalité. Sortis de là, nous nous apercevons que tout le reste est gai, varié, nombreux. Mais on ne sort pas de là quand ni comme on veut. Quelle était judicieuse la remontrance d'un de mes maris. Mais tu ne peux donc pas écrire un livre qui ne soit d'amour, d'adultère, de collage mi-incestueux, de rupture. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas autre chose dans la vie ? Si le temps ne l'eût pressé de courir, car il était beau et charmant, vers des rendez-vous amoureux, il m'aurait peut-être enseigné ce qui a licence de tenir, dans un roman et hors du roman, la place de l'amour. Il partait, donc, et au long du même papier bleuâtre qui, sur la table obscure, guide en ce moment ma main comme un phosphore, je consignais, incorrigible, quelques chapitres dédiés à l'amour, un chapitre tout aveuglé d'amour. Je m'y nommais Renée Néré, ou bien, prémonitoire, j'agençais une Léa. Voilà que, légalement, littérairement et familièrement, je n'ai plus qu'un nom, qui est le mien. Ne fallait-il pas, pour en arriver là, pour en revenir là, que 30 ans de ma vie ? Je finirais par croire que ce n'était pas payé trop cher. Love, one of the great commonplaces of existence, is slowly leaving mine. The maternal instinct is another great commonplace. Once we've left these behind, we find that all the rest is gay and varied, and that there is plenty of it. But one doesn't leave all that behind when or as one pleases. How wise one of my husbands was when he remonstrated, "But is it impossible for you to write a book that isn't about love, adultery, semi-incestuous relations, and final separation? Aren't there other things in life?" If he had not been in such a hurry to get to his amorous rendezvous, for he was handsome and charming, he might perhaps have taught me what can take the place of love in a novel and out of it. But he went, and I continued, obstinately covering that same bluish paper, gleaming at this moment from the dark table to guide my hand, with chapters dedicated to love, or regret for love, chapters blind with love. In them I called myself Renée Néré, or else, prophetically, I introduced a Léa. So it came about that both legally and familiarly, as well as in my books, I now only have one name, which is my own. Did it take only 30 years of my life to reach that point, or rather to get back to it? I shall end by thinking that it wasn't too high a price to pay.
Thank you. Beautiful reading. I think we'll pass straight on, Deborah, if that's okay, to your reading.
Bonsoir à tous. I'm going to read a few pages from a short piece about Colette in my new collection of pieces on many French writers. There is a photograph that you need to see. I know you can't, but there we go. I fell in love with her before I read any of her books. To my teenage eyes, smeared with black coal, I believed it made me look wasted. It was the era of punk, after all, and we were all in mourning for the future. Colette had a self-possessed kind of beauty that I felt she owned and hired to the photographer. Even better, as far as I was concerned, living as I did in the suburbs of London, where everyone looked the same and even called their dogs the same name. There were 3 dogs called Spot in my street alone. Colette was a writer who looked like a movie star. I looked nothing like her. Her dog was called Toby Chien. I don't know how I chanced upon this photograph. I do know it was a freezing December in 1973, and the central heating had broken down in our family house. The doorbell rang, and my mother shouted at me to let in the man who had arrived to fix the heating. He poked around in the cupboard where the boiler was and said, "I officially condemn this boiler. The law says you have to buy a new one." Then he winked at me and switched it on. The pipes in the house started to whir and clank like an old tractor. When I at last returned to my bedroom, I had to fight my way through the black smoke coiling out of the radiator. Despite it being a very posed image, this photograph, there was something about the way Colette had contrived its artifice that connected with me. She was a working writer who had a purpose in life. I could see immediately that she was enjoying the theatre of inventing herself to portray this purpose. This was of particular interest to me in that phase of my own life. I was born in South Africa and grew up in Britain. When I glimpsed this photo at 13 years old, I had lived in Britain for 4 years, not quite long enough to feel that I was English. Colette was presenting herself in a way that appealed to my teenage idea of what a European female writer might be like. Glamorous, serious, intellectual, playful, with a mean, sleek cat sitting on her writing desk amongst the flowers, all of them bathed in an arc of French light. When I started to read her books, all that was transgressive and sensuous in her writing blew like a wind from Burgundy, Paris, and the south of France into the damp suburban gardens of London. Her affairs with women and her 3 marriages meant she had 1 foot in and 1 out of the bourgeois life of her era. She became a thritic in middle age and often wore mannish open sandals with her elegant dresses, much to the agony of her more conventional second husband. I knew none of this when I first glimpsed the photograph, yet somehow I intuited she'd had an experimental life. What is the point of having any other sort of life? This is what I thought to myself in the suburbs of London. Outside, I could hear one of the dogs called Spot barking at a cat called Snowy. 20 years later, when I read La Vagabonde, I had cause to agree with her light but slyly deep assertion, "I want nothing from love but love." Yes, what else is it we would want from love apart from love? Too many things, as it happens.
We're going to talk mainly about Colette's writing, but after that eloquent passage about Colette's effect as a kind of public persona on you, Deborah, I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about that. What effect the Colette, the woman, or at least the public image that we get of the woman, had on each of you. when you first discovered her, for example. Emmanuelle, would you like to start?
Okay. Bonsoir. I must apologize a little for the English because it's been a long time, so I'll try my best. I discovered Colette when I was 20 years old, and it was late because for my generation in France, Colette, I'm sorry to say that, but Colette was what we call ringard. I never studied her at school, for example, and we were more into intellectual literature, like Le Nouveau Roman, the literature of the disaster, Samuel Beckett, that kind of things, which are really great books, really great. But Colette, for my generation, she was a female writer, and it was not a compliment. It was something like commercial books for women, and that existed. And she had written about cats and dogs and flowers. Well, okay, so that was dumb, obviously. And I began to read her, and then I discovered she was a genius. So I was very pleased. But you have these differences between the generations. In France. I don't know in England, but in France, it's really important. And I wrote this book, and when I began to talk with the people, every generation told me, oh yeah, Colette, my grandmother loved her, my mother loved her, my aunt loved her, my cousin, and it was like an army of women coming from different ages, which was, with her. So it was very nice to see it, and it was very nice also to explore the misunderstandings that had led me to think, as many people of my generation, that Colette was not that important. And I hope I managed to do it.
That critical denigration lasted quite a long time. One critic who grew up in France in the 1950s, so a long time before you, said that serious literature in those days was considered to be about, I forget the exact word, darkness and nothingness and night. And Colette was clearly not about darkness, nothingness and night, so therefore was then not taken seriously. Michèle, what was your sense of her as a public persona?
I think I really got involved with Colette's writing quite late on, in the late 70s, when the women's press brought out La Naissance du Jour in Enid MacLeod's translation, Break of Day. I think the book should be called Birth of Day, because it's about rebirth through memory and through love and through the figure of the mother appearing as a kind of erotic ghost. And before that, I had rebelled against my own mother, who taught French literature and refused to read most of the books she thought were wonderful. Absolutely pathetic teenage stuff, but there you go. And then I was also swerved off the Colette track by the kind of perception of her that came, I think, via, I'm afraid, Hollywood, as a sort of frou-frou, naughty, knickerbockers, girls kicking up their legs at the Moulin Rouge. I mean, Colette had a terrible reputation here. So discovering more translations in the late 70s and then beginning to read her in French, I discovered that she was a great modernist. She invented autofiction 100 years ago. She invented new forms for novels that nobody else was doing. And then I started reading her in French and appreciating her much more. I didn't really get to grips with her visual image for a very, very long time. I don't think that was what mattered. It was the images her books conjured for me that mattered.
Thank you. Deborah, did you want to say anything else on that theme? I really like your phrase about her enjoyment of the theatre of inventing herself. I don't know if you want to enlarge on that.
Yeah, so, I read the Claudine books when I was 13, 14. But then 50, I was reading, I've read her all my life, but I was reading a collection of short stories called Rainy Moon. And just to speak to Michèle's point about Colette being a modernist, well, that's so true. and inventing autofiction, I was very struck in a story called Bella Vista. Her difference from Simone de Beauvoir, I mean, we know there's a big difference, right? But here's the thing that I learned from her when I was writing my trilogy of living autobiographies. So the narrator, who's in the story, who's rather like Colette, but not her, something a bit like her, buys a small house in Saint-Tropez. And so there's lots about where to put a table, what to put on the windows, where the shower is going to be, everything that Beauvoir would have despised, okay? But then she says, and that's where I'm going to work. And that's the thing about Colette, is that she embodied everything. She didn't mock the endeavor of making a home, making a place. And it was and that's where I'm going to sleep, and that's where I'm going to work. So in that sense, like I'm encouraged by her sense of purpose and her enjoyment of the life she is creating for herself.
And we have to complete that opening part. We have the translation into French of Deborah's passage about Colette. Thanks, Olivia, for reminding me. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten that bit.
It's also beautifully translated, so I thought it would be nice to hear for those who are less comfortable with the English, maybe as well. Je suis tombée amoureuse d'elle avant de lire un seul de ses livres. À mes yeux d'adolescente que je noircissais de colle pour avoir l'air nihiliste et perdu, c'était l'époque punk après tout, et on était tous en deuil du futur, Colette avait une beauté souveraine dont elle était la seule propriétaire et qu'elle ne faisait que louer aux photographes. Encore mieux pour moi qui vivais dans une banlieue de Londres où tout le monde se ressemblait, jusqu'aux chiens qui portaient tous le même nom. Rien que dans ma rue, il y en avait 3 qui s'appelaient Spot. Colette était une écrivaine qui avait tout d'une star de cinéma. Mais je ne lui ressemblais pas, et son chien s'appelait Toby Chien. Je ne sais pas comment j'ai mis la main sur cette photo, mais je sais que c'était en décembre 1973, qu'il faisait un froid glacial, et que notre chauffage était tombé en panne. On sonnait à la porte et ma mère me criait de faire entrer le réparateur. Il a fureté autour du placard où se trouvait la chaudière avant d'annoncer « Je déclare cette chaudière officiellement morte. La loi vous oblige à en acheter une autre. » Puis il m'a fait un clin d'œil et il l'a rallumée. Les tuyaux se sont mis à ronronner dans toute la maison, à cliqueter comme un vieux tracteur. Quand j'ai enfin pu regagner ma chambre, j'ai dû me frayer un chemin dans les panaches de fumée noire qui jaillissaient de mon radiateur en spiralant jusqu'au plafond. Bien que cette image soit très statique, j'y voyais la façon dont Colette maniait l'artifice. Et je m'en sentais très proche. C'était une écrivaine au travail, qui avait une ambition dans la vie. J'ai tout de suite vu qu'elle prenait plaisir à inventer son personnage, à déployer le théâtre de cette ambition. Ce qui, à cette période de ma vie, m'intéressait tout particulièrement. Je suis née en Afrique du Sud et j'ai grandi en Angleterre. Quand je tombe sur cette photo à 13 ans, je vis en Angleterre depuis 4 ans. Pas assez longtemps pour que je me sente anglaise. Colette se présentait d'une façon qui correspondait à l'idée qu'adolescente je me faisais d'une femme de lettres venant d'Europe. Glamour, sérieuse, intellectuelle, spirituelle, un beau chat élancé assis parmi les fleurs sur son bureau, le tout baigné par les rayons d'une arche de lumière française. Quand j'ai commencé à lire ses livres, tout ce qui était transgressif et sensuel dans son écriture a soufflé sur les jardins humides de la banlieue de Londres un air vif de Provence, de Bourgogne, Paris, sud de la France. Ses amours avec des femmes et ses 3 mariages, dont le premier avec un bon vivant pervers et corrompu qui signait ses premiers romans à sa place, me signifiaient qu'elle avait un pied en dehors de la vie bourgeoise de son temps. Devenue arthritique au mi-temps de sa vie, elle portait des sandales d'homme sous ses robes élégantes, aux grandes dames de son très conventionnel 2e mari. Je ne savais rien de tout ça lorsque, pour la première fois, je suis tombée sur cette photo, mais j'avais l'intuition qu'elle avait vécu toutes sortes d'expériences. À quoi bon vivre une autre vie, me disais-je. Dehors, j'entendais l'un des chiens, qui s'appelait Spot, aboyer contre un chat qui s'appelait Minou. 20 ans plus tard, quand j'ai lu La Vagabonde, j'avais tout pour souscrire à cette affirmation, apparemment légère mais très profonde. Je ne voudrais de l'amour, enfin, que l'amour. En effet, que voudrions-nous de l'amour à part l'amour ? Trop de choses, évidemment.
We'll try to get to love, inevitably, and to mothers and to animals as well. But just before we do that, Matt, could we just briefly talk about Colette's realism? It's always struck me that she's not known, I mean, I agree, absolutely she's a modernist, but she isn't seen as somebody who was particularly writing realistically about her period. But Angela Carter once wrote, for example, that Colette provided some of the most truthful expositions of the dilemma of a free woman in a patriarchal society. And in a number of ways, starting even with the Claudine and the representation of the educational system of the Third Republic, I think there are elements of realism, of social realism in Colette that it might be worth just mentioning before we move on to love and so on. Shall I start with you, Michèle?
Well, one of the things that happened to Colette as a young woman was that while her brothers were given the proper masculine education, the family had fallen on hard times financially. She was just sent to the village school, which was, perfectly decent public school, but it wasn't bourgeois. And I think the Claudine books are not particularly realist because they're written for Willy and they're under instruction. He said, spice it up a bit. She wrote the original, didn't she, in that exercise book and put it in the drawer. Willy found it, thought rubbish. Then he read it again and said, there's something here, but spice it up. So you've got to, she's doing a sort of Dance of the Seven Veils, I think, as a prose stylist in all her books. But in those Claudine books about, the school, the first one, maybe there's a truthfulness about being a teenage girl overcome with violent emotions, with needs to chew chalk and to be sly, to be very funny, to be rebellious. But there's also, as we've already mentioned, Colette performing herself. So realism, yes, but of a sort of almost pantomime nature sometimes, I think.
Yeah. Emmanuelle?
Yeah, I suppose what is striking with her, because she had a very long career as a writer. She was 20 with the Claudine. She dies in 1954 at 80 years old. And she wrote almost 80 books, something like that. If we can talk about realism, I think it's because Colette is not afraid of what she sees. And then she's not afraid of writing what she sees through her body. Because the senses in Colette are really important. And when she sees something, she feels it. And when she feels it, she writes it. In a way, you can feel it too. So from the 20-years-old woman to the old woman who is dying and knows she is dying, and the last books are really moving because she knows she won't be able to write anymore and she knows she will die, she's never afraid of nothing. And I suppose this evolution, this evolution, is also due to her long career as a journalist. She was a very passionate journalist. She needed to earn money, and she earned money with her books as a novelist and as a journalist too. And I feel that writing her pieces for the newspapers, forced her to write in a kind of a hurry and to get straight to the point. So she was even more fearless afterwards. In that way, we can say that she has a kind of poetic realism in the sense that reality is for her something like a mixture between the feelings, what she sees, and the social structures she perceives in the society.
Yes. She did famously say, didn't she, to her friend Renée, look a long time at what pleases you, and even longer at what displeases you. So that connects.
Yes, maybe a kind of, for me, not so much realism, but she was very much in the world. She placed all her female characters in the center of the world of her fictions. So maybe La Vagabonde, where I really enjoy her her preoccupation with money, with earning a living, with budgeting for her evening meal, and her relationship with, would Bragg be the right pronunciation? Bragg. So he's her colleague on stage with her. He gets her the music hall gigs, and they sit on trains, they eat together, they understand each other very well. And because he's not a lover, because she has no romantic interest in him, there's a sort of realism in that relationship of old friends who are on the road, touring theatres together, getting through the evening, and the loneliness of touring and needing each other.
Can I, Deborah, add that this character, Bragg, is inspired by the real person who is Georges Wag, who was the greatest mime of his time, and he's the one who taught Colette how to perform on stage. So La Vagabonde, what you say, is the description of her years as professional of the stage, and that this realism you're talking about is inspired by a real character, a real man.
And perhaps the music hall is one of the most realist parts of her work, in the sense that I don't think anybody else had ever represented that apparently glamorous life on stage from the point of view of the underpaid, often underfed dancers dancers and other performers who actually managed to produce that wonderful spectacle on stage, and which of course she knew intimately from the inside. So yes, both in journalism and perhaps particularly in that part. Okay, shall we talk about love then in Colette? The quotation that we had read so beautifully at the beginning talks about two things. One, how love appears in so much of Colette's writing is a central theme. And the other then pronounces love to be l'une des grandes banalités de la vie, one of life's great commonplaces. So how does Colette represent love, would you say?
I think for Colette there's a sense of battle, of fear of dependence, of inequality, and she incisively writes about, I think, couples where inequality is major. So, for example, an older woman who is a rich courtesan and her much younger lover, or in homosexual love, two people who are playing out particular roles. She writes in Le Pur et l'Impur a lot about love in that sense. She writes about a man who's got a cat, whose wife is very jealous of the cat, and the major drama in La Chatte is about a woman's jealousy of an animal. So there's always, I think, this sense of tugging and pulling and voracity and fear. I mean, she is wonderfully open about female lusts and hungers and desires. Women are voracious and greedy and beautifully sensual and want it and want it and want a lot. And then she's also writing about a tug away, I think, a fear of being dominated, a fear of being swallowed up in turn. And she's not just writing about homosexual love or just heterosexual love. I think also the love, I know we're going to talk about mothers in a bit, but I think her mother is a terribly important person in her writing about love. But maybe I shouldn't go into that now.
Yeah. Deborah, Emmanuelle?
Yeah, well, I suppose Chérie and La Fin, the Chérie. I wonder, though, Emmanuelle, whether Colette is actually writing about love in those books. I mean, so we have the courtesan Lear, who she's been gifted this beautiful young man by his mother, Charlotte Bellot. He says, take him, Lear, make a man of him. And they're not supposed to fall in love, but apparently we understand that they're very preoccupied with each other, and so Colette will always make that, she'll embody that, she'll make it physical. And but I'm not sure really it's about love. I think it's about control. Emmanuelle, I was suggesting that in a way Colette was a sort of dominatrix, which I'll leave you to develop. But they all, yes. And Michèle's point that there's sort of undercurrent of a war. So the bed in Chérie is described as an iron bed, like armor, something like that. And she was, and I love it that Colette allows her female characters to become vulnerable, foolish, swept away. She has no shame about that because she's so clever. She's just such a clever writer.
Yeah, she is. She's, I suppose I said she was a dominatrix because I see her as an individual who had to conquer her freedom. As a woman, as an artist, as a writer. And she had to fight the battle in times where it was really difficult to fight. I mean, she's the only one of her generation to have reached that point of fame and of control of her production. In the extract you read, she says, finally, it took me 30 years to get my name on the book, because when she began to write, Willy, he was saying Willy, but we say Willy in France. Willy was firming the books, and then she gained the right to put Colette and Willy, and then Colette. But at the time she could write Colette on her books, she was 50 years old. It was 30 years of a career to earn the right to put her name on the book, which was, by the way, the name of her father. That's another question. And I suppose to reach that point, she had to be very strategic, very clever, and kind of a control freak, I suppose. And you can feel it in the way, in Chérie and La Fin de Chérie, I have a masterpiece alert. La Fin de Chérie, for me, was one of the greatest novels in the 20th century. I can say it quietly. You can feel this control. She's doing whatever she wants with the characters, and she also has a kind of mean way to behave with them. I mean, cruelty is part of love in Colette's work, including in the motherly love. The cruelty is the part of the devoration of love. So, yeah, what I called dominatrix was this way of always making, the mind win the battle, letting the body express itself, but in the end, within the book, that's the artist who is winning the battle.
I think the talking about the body, I think perhaps you wanted to talk about that as well, Michèle, but the body is so important in Colette that rather than a narrator who gives us a kind of psychological account of what's happening, almost everything happens through the body, and the characters come alive as their bodies, so that it's gesture and even features and colouring and so on that express emotion more than words. Her characters, for example, Chérie in La Fin de Chérie, neither Léa nor especially Chérie are articulate characters. They don't talk very much, they don't say very much. When they do, it might be just a couple of onomatopoeic syllables sometimes with which they express themselves, but their bodies express everything. And I'm not sure about there not being any love. It seems to me that out of his vulnerability and the very strange life he's had, and then La Fin de Chérie, in the end of Chérie, Chérie comes back from the First World War as a kind of hero, but he's, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, I think, nowadays. And out of that, his memory, nostalgic memory of Léa, I think could be described as love. And when it can't work, then the only answer is death.
He's mourning for love.
He's mourning for love, exactly.
In Chérie, I think love becomes a disaster because right at the end, when Chérie returns to Léa after he's got married and they've separated, and they have a rapturous night, and there's this amazing description of an orgasm, which is much better in French than English. But what's the disaster is when Chérie says to Léa, "You did love me then," and she suddenly breaks into speech and tells him she loves him, and she overdoes it. She starts planning their future together. They're going to run away to the Riviera, and language is the undoing. When the bodies are speaking in this rapturous sex they have, everything's fine, but the minute she says she loves him, disaster. So love is, it's about physical pleasure, but it's also about an ambiguity about language, I think.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. One vital form of love in Colette is, of course, also love of the mother, maternal love or filial love, perhaps even more. So the figure of Sido dominates of Colette's own mother, but transformed into a kind of Colette creation. Sido is absolutely central. Perhaps you would like to start on that, Michèle, since you've been thinking about Sido.
Well, she's presented as a sort of goddess, if you look at La Maison de Claudine, which is a very beautiful book that purports to be a series of memoir vignettes. But of course it's invented. It's this auto-fiction parading as memoir. And we encounter Sido as a kind of goddess. And what we learn about Sido is that she was brought up in a family where she was encouraged to read philosophy. So she read Fourier. And she learned from Fourier that the passions are crucial and must be integrated into life, and that the problem with bourgeois and Christian culture is that the passions are seen as the root of all evil, whereas the opposite is true. If we only acknowledged them and integrated them, we would live fully and richly and happily, and there'd be a socialist revolution and all kinds of really good things would be happening. So Sido, I think, she's not only this country goddess who knows how to kind of milk a cow and take rose cuttings and rescues pregnant serving girls and is altogether absolutely wonderful and fights the curé and takes her dog to church, and she's an absolutely glorious, let's call it, invention. But she's also a philosopher. She went to bed every night with volumes of philosophy, and I think her husband was banished to his own bedroom sometimes when Sido was much more involved with philosophy. So what she does for me is she reunites what gets split apart in Christian culture, which is the body and the soul. Sido reunites them, reintegrates them, and allows Colette to do the same. And that's why I think Colette's realism is infused with something, I call it the radiant body of the world, something numinous. It's partly that she can name 6 different kinds of brioche or ways to make them, but it's also what that's doing on other levels. And I think the source of that inspiration is Sido, yes. A goddess, but a wonderfully pagan one, not a Christian saint at all.
I think I was aware of pseudo being an invention from quite early on. I mean, that didn't stop me from wanting a mother, just like Sido, who'd make me hot chocolate in that particular way with an egg yolk, who would show me a spider spinning a web in the garden, who would show me plants and animals. But actually, I didn't believe her. Not entirely. And that was very interesting to me. Marguerite Duras, writing a lot about mothers, says, our mothers are the craziest people we know. And I believe Duras. I think there's some truth in that. And Colette could have gone there. You see, she's not really so much of a realist, but she doesn't. She really needs this invention, and it's a beautiful one. I'm very happy to have it inside me.
Yeah, I suppose we have, with Colette, we have to read beneath the lines and the books, because she never explains what she's doing. She never explains, never complains. Colette is like that. And as for the motherly love, I think we have two clues in her work. We have first L'enfant et les sortilèges. I don't know if you know L'enfant et les sortilèges, which is a little piece she wrote for Maurice Ravel. And it's the story of a very young child who's really angry because his mother told him to do his work and to behave, and he doesn't want to, and he breaks everything. And okay, the point which interests me in that is that when Colette describes, it's for the stage, she writes this character of the mother who is huge, and the public will only see her legs. The public will never see her, the whole mother. So she puts the public at the level of a 3-year-old child. And I believe she never got out of her childhood. I believe she managed, because, in poetry you can, to be a grown woman and someone who experiences a free sexuality through marriage, creation, but she remained in the garden of her childhood, I believe. The second clue is a little piece of work she gave to a newspaper when her daughter was born, which is called in France Les Premières Heures, and she describes what happens when the child is born. And it's not convenient at all. I mean, it's not what you should say. You should say you're very happy and you meet your child and you're filled with happiness and you feel complete. And she writes the opposite. She writes the fear. She doesn't know what to do with the baby. She doesn't know if she will be able to love the baby. We're in 1913. It's very early to do that. So with these two brief pieces of work, we have, I think, slight idea of what she had to struggle with in her personal life and as a writer.
I really agree, because I think when she idealises Sido, it rings an alarm bell in the reader, doesn't it? And I think what you've said about the mother links to Colette's way of talking about love, that the other can be huge and terrifying, but you can swap those roles around, perhaps.
Yeah.
And in some ways, looking at Colette biographically, it can seem problematic that despite the very idealized mother figure who becomes her own model, her own creation of Sido becomes a kind of model for how she herself will age, But despite that, Colette was not a good mother or a devoted mother. But you deal with that really interestingly in your book, I think, Emmanuelle.
Yeah, because it was when I began to write about her, I began to read a lot, of course. That's the least you can do. And I was worried about the way people looked at her. And she was, and particularly on that point, oh, what a bad mother she was. So I tried to understand where this was coming from. And it was coming from the testimony of her child, Colette de Jouvenel. Yes, she named her daughter like herself. That was not a good idea. This woman said how do you say it? She lacked of her mother, yeah, her own childhood. She waited her mother to care for her, and her mother never came. She was sent away in a pension. Okay. But I was saying to myself, in those times, what could Colette do? I mean, she couldn't be like Sido. She couldn't stay at home and be there for her child while having her career as a writer and as a journalist. So she did what most of the men did. She didn't take care every day of her daughter. But she was present for her. She wrote a lot. Her daughter was present in her mind. So I don't know. It's easy to say what a bad mother. I don't know what kind of choice she had. So I'm trying to, just to put it in that way. Yeah, it's easy to judge from now a woman of her generation. She was born in 1873. I think it was impossible for her to remain the writer she was and the journalist she was, and to raise a child the way she was raised by her mother. I think it's an impossible choice. The interesting thing is the choice she made to have a child, because she had a child when she was 40 years old, and she had a long career as a lover. So if she hadn't got a child before, is because she knew how not to have one. So we can suppose that at 40 she chose to have a child. That's, for me, a most interesting point of view to see.
And also we know, don't we, that Sido sent Gabri away to a wet nurse who was called Mélie. So, I mean, I think in the kind of bourgeois idealization of perfect motherhood, which continues from generation to generation in perhaps slightly tweaked guises, there's an absolutely unwillingness to face the fact that loads and loads of women were parted from their children. The wet nurse in the village had Colette for, I think, a couple of years. Middle class people sent their children to boarding schools. So this idea of the bad mother, I agree that it must have been Colette's decision as a writer. But also there were norms of not being with your child 24 hours a day in French culture.
Particularly in that time when she had a daughter, she was a baroness. She was not in the bourgeoisie, she was in the aristocracy, which is another kind of way of life.
Yes, I think she would have loved that. For a while, but it wasn't really for her. She's an unsentimental writer. Yeah. She's not a kind writer. She has Chéri. Chéri is Fred. I always prefer to call him Fred. He hates his mother, and Lear is the age of his mother, right? So so she becomes the sort of loving, there's unquestioning. It's not unquestioning, actually. It's unconditional. The unconditional love that he sort of desires. Lear provides. So Colette is very aware of that, the sort of rather perverse exchange that the mother is and Lear are sort of up to.
And I suppose it's what she found in her relationship with Missy, because we didn't talk about Mathilde de Morny, who was the woman Colette lived with for 5 or 6 years. And she was a woman who was living travestied as a man. She was, I suppose we could say, a transsexual. At those times, that did not exist formally, but. And when she talks about Missy and when she talks about their relationship, we can see that kind of, love. Missy was older and she was providing for her, she was helping her, and she was always there for her. So it was a kind of motherly love from Missy to her.
There are very lyrical passages in Lévry de la Vigne.
Lévry de la Vigne
Missy,
and Le Pur et
exactly
l'Impur
that.
also.
Also that. Olivia, could I ask you just to read 2 sentences? It's just as a link, really. They're just there for a very poetic description. Yeah, and then there's the translation. A very poetic description of Sido in La Maison de Claudine, which also takes us on, I think, to the next subject. Thank you. You'll read it so much better than if I try and do it.
Elle vécut balayée d'ombre et de lumière, courbée sous des tourmentes, résignée, changeante et généreuse, parée d'enfants, de fleurs et d'animaux, comme un domaine nourricier. So she lived on, swept by shadow and sunshine, bowed by bodily torments, rich in children, flowers, and animals, like a fruitful domain.
Thank you. So Sido in old age, as described by Colette, Sido as Colette's creation in old age, but also rich in children and flowers and animals. And I think we should discuss that, really. One of the reasons that for a long time Colette was not considered a serious writer who wrote about night and nothingness was because of she has talking animals, she has a great fondness for gardens, there's a lot of detail about flowers and so on. And I think that helped to kind of trivialize the way that she was seen, but actually it can be seen very differently, her nature writing of various sorts. So I don't know, would anybody like to start on that?
She's in the world, the plants and the animals share the planet with her. Just to put it like that, I mean, what a ridiculous idea that somehow to sort of feminize all of this. I mean, Beauvoir, she said, when she's talking about housework, she said some women take to housework like other people take to drink. I really like that. You have to sort of put them together because Colette is never actually dusting anything, or washing a floor or making up a bed or doing the laundry, but she's in the world of trees and fruit and animals. So, a cat has a claw like a rose thorn, or tasting a grape is like discovering a whole new nervous system. These are the things that I remember from Colette. So to be able to write about plants and animals and the world that we inhabit with them, they with us, is really important. I mean, I'm often asked why there are flies and mosquitoes in my work, and bees. And I say, well, because I live with them. They live with me.
Absolutely.
Colette did say about this second husband who was always off chasing other women, that he said once that if he came into a room where Colette was alone with one of her animals, he felt incredibly anxious and uneasy because he felt, I think, that she had an animal soul, and that really wasn't. It might be fashionable in terms of, paint your talons red and wear a posh fur coat and pretend to be a little minx and waggle your tail, but Colette was the real thing. I don't think she always felt there was a huge distinction between a person and the planet we live in, because again, I think that came from a a much more sort of Christian idea about man is there to dominate the natural world. Because Colette was a pagan and a philosopher, you know, post-Fourier, as it were, she could see the kinship that we have with the natural world that we're part of. I mean, she didn't put it like that. I've put it very, very pompously. She puts it much more beautifully.
Absolutely, Emmanuelle.
Yes, I remember, Deborah, we were talking about her frame. No, yeah, you were telling me this wonderful idea that she built her frame and she remained within her frame. And I think every writer has to build his or her frame. And Colette was moving a lot. She had a lot of apartments and houses, but the frame remained always the same. It's what you said. It's the bed, the desk, the flowers, a cat, a dog.
And I work there.
And I work there. And if you have that, a room of your own, you have everything you need. And that's the strength of Colette, that she is really what we call grand genre no, in France. She likes money, she wants money, she likes to eat, she likes to go out. But in fact, she needs very few things because the love in Colette is a kind of devoration of the living. And the living can be a flower, it can be an animal, it can be a man, a woman, or a child. But what interests her is the living, and she will keep that until the end, the very end, when she is really, really weak. She will still have this in her room with the fire in the chimney. That will be the last thing she can see and the last thing she can write about, because she has a frame.
And it's absolutely true, I think, that there is little distinction between different forms of sentient being in the world in Colette. There's a whole web of similes and metaphors that somebody quoted, somebody mentioned this at one point, that animals are described in terms of flowers, and flowers are described in terms of people, and people are described in terms of skies and planets, and there's a kind of unity of living, of the planet, that I mean, one can see Colette, I think, as a kind of eco-feminist almost, you know, avant la lettre.
But not just that. The animals are there because her female characters at different times are lonely. Mm-hmm. So they're really there they enable Colette to have a conversation about loneliness without really going there, because they are women, they're alone in the world, and they have dogs, and they have cats, and so the sort of close relationship with them, with the animals, are also another way of describing solitude.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I just did want to add that Colette talks about how Sido taught her as a child to look but not to devour, to look but not to touch in case you spoil it. So with a butterfly, look but don't touch. It wasn't a prudery, it was respect this amazing world that we're part of. And when Emmanuelle talks about Colette writing about love as a sort of devouring, in her later books she writes about not devouring, about stepping back, about letting go, about not possessing. And I find that very, very moving too, that I think she does go on being pretty greedy right to the end, but she knows that you mustn't be that baby with an enormous mouth and teeth who wants to eat everything. She writes about a sort of contemplative letting go. You don't have to really believe her that she was acting it out in her own life. I mean, that's something else.
That is something else. I was going to ask you one more question about the sort of, I think it's Emmanuelle. And then after that I was going to ask you if you have any questions, so if you'd like to think about them for a moment. You say at one point, Emmanuelle, c'est une œuvre juste, créatrice d'une morale qu'elle s'est elle-même forgée. So in English, her work is just, it creates an ethos forged by Colette herself. And I wonder what you think Colette's, if Colette's writing rather than Colette the woman in a sense, but if the writing provides us with a kind of ethos, with a set of values, what would that be?
I don't know. I'm sure that for a writer, and particularly for a female writer, the ethos is what we talked about, is never mind the solitude, because that's the price to pay. Work here and be your own principal. Don't do what's expected from you. Do otherwise.
Yeah, that's nice. Work here, like Deborah.
She took a great pleasure in life. So that's not sentimental, right? Because sort of women weren't supposed to take so much pleasure. It was supposed to be much more self-sacrificing and to have a talent for sort of stamping on their own desires. So she I was aware of this really from 13. I thought, whoa. I mean, these girls, this mother, these animals, and then much later, reading really serious books like The Pure and the Impure, lots of darkness and philosophy and night in The Pure and the Impure. She had absolutely no shame about pleasure and desire.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and I suppose I've put it to myself as it's about trusting the body, trusting the knowledge of the body, seeing where that takes you, then writing about it.
Great, thank you. Good answers. Does anybody want to put a question to the writers? I can see one question over there.
Thanks very much. That really is fascinating. I learned a lot this evening. But from the little that I know about Colette and what you've said this evening has made me wonder, and I'm thinking particularly about Le Blé en Herbe, whether she would be published and approved of today.
Well, Le Blé en Herbe is about two teenagers who have sex. So I know we live in an age of... there's always moral anxiety about what young people are getting up to.
Well, I suppose she's not talking about the teenage part.
Oh, you mean the older woman?
Yeah, you're talking about the older woman.
Seducing the boy. Oh, I hope it would get published. Let's say just, down with all taboos, down with all censorship.
Maybe I can... For those who don't know the story, Colette had an affair with her, how do you say, stepson, the son of her second husband, the Baron de Jouvenel, Bertrand de Jouvenel, when he was 16, 17 years old, and she was something like 15, near 15. So she initiated him, as we say. And The Blé en Herbe is the transposition of this story in a fictional novel. I don't know. I suppose when it was published, they didn't made it public that the story was real. So they were hiding behind fiction, Nowadays, I don't know. That's a question I've asked myself, because when I read about the love story between Colette and her stepson, I was kind of ill at ease, I was... Maybe my younger self would have said, oh, okay, that's good, everyone is fine, and she was so liberated. But I don't know, I have a son and he has a stepmother, and I mean... Well, so... and I'm not a prude, but I mean... What kind of consent could have this young boy? But there were times where, the children, the boys of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy were sent to prostitutes to be initiated. So it was another time. So I decided, to read what the man, because he wrote a text when he was a man to testify. So I wrote what this man said, and he said he was perfectly happy with it. So I said, okay, so be it. He was happy, he was happy. I have no answer. I don't know. I don't know if there's a publisher in the room. I don't know. Who can answer you?
I think it's quite possible that the more eyebrows would be raised. It would be more assumed that this would be damaging for the young boy, who subsequently became the man who said it didn't damage him. Yeah, that. Yeah, no, that the Emmanuel Macron story with his much older wife might have been seen, might have shocked, or would have shocked if it had been written in a literary form. Is that right? Roughly.
I just want to add something about Colette, is that she didn't raise the boy. That's a very important point. I mean, she didn't raise him. He did not grow up with her. He was living with his mother, and he met her when he was a teenager. But she didn't raise him. So it's an important thing to say.
There was a question over there, I think.
Yeah, no, it was more like an answer, actually, because someone said, is there a publisher in the room? Like, is there a doctor in the room? I'm sure there's more than one publisher in the room. In fact, there's two, as far as I can see. But I'm one of them, and I published one day a story. I mean, it's not a solecism, but I published one day a story by Emmanuelle Lambert called The Living Days, Les Jours Vivants, which is the story of Mary, this 73-year-old white woman who falls desperately in love with this 13-year-old Jamaican boy. And I'll tell you how it came out here in England. It was destroyed by The Guardian, and this character was described as a predator, a sexual predator, which, Ananda Devi was just pulling her hair out. She thought, what's going on? So I think that that's what would happen today, probably. It depends, it would be published, but for sensationalist reasons, in England at least, yeah.
Were there other questions? There's a question here at the front. Yeah.
Hi. So we're students from the French lycée, and so as you may know, Colette is now in the program of a French bac. So we can see that she's evolved from being ringard to actually quite famous. And so I was just wondering, what were your thoughts on the fact that now 17-year-olds actually study her at school?
Oh, I think it's great. I have to say that she had been really famous previously. She was a huge star. She was really, when she died in the 50s, maybe she was the most notorious French writer in the world. I mean, and then later she went down like that. And then today she's raising again, so that's a good thing. But to give you an example, we have this year, it's the anniversary of her birth, les 150 ans, and nothing has been scheduled in France. We wrote a book, I wrote my book, there's une historienne, Bénédicte Verzage-Seignon, who wrote a very good book about Colette during the occupation, but no exhibition, nothing. And I think she's a little underrated nowadays. And I hope that the fact that she's coming back to school is a good sign and that she will be rising again. But I must say that, for example, for the people who are 60, 70 years old today, they studied, they learned how to write and to read with Colette. They were doing all the dictées at school with Colette. She was really, really, really famous. It's before the Second World War that she began to, and I suppose that she came back with the gender studies in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and that's what enabled her to come back with a new modernity in the 60s, 70s.
Because in the 70s, women's writing was a radical concept. It didn't mean second rate because it's feminine. The other didn't have to mean lesser. Otherness could be, as it were, rescued and invigorated and examined. And women's writing in this country helped Colette become published in translation or reissued in older translations. And I think now, again, we've probably lost that concept, and people think women's writing is, middle-brow, best-selling, people are very sneery about it, aren't they? Chick lit, whatever. In her lifetime, Colette was amazing because she was a bestseller. She was read by, as it were, ordinary people. She slowly acquired a readership of the great male literary stars, like Gide wrote her fan letters, Proust wrote her fan letters.
It took him time.
It took
Gide.
him time, but he got there.
It took him
and
time.
She
was 50 years old when
yeah,
he
but that's
finally
always the
wrote
way
a letter.
perhaps with women. But she was given a state funeral. She was given, many, many prestigious literary awards in France. So everything Emmanuelle says, yes, yes.
And that crossover between, high literature and being read by everybody, women mainly. She always managed that. I mean, she was always very, very widely read, and read because she was a delight to read. And then, to a lesser extent, taken seriously as a writer, but eventually that was the case. And I was also going to make a small case for feminist criticism. I think it was the feminist criticism of starting in the 70s that brought her back, that took her seriously and looked at her, the femininity, if you like, of her writing and her style as something absolutely worthwhile and interesting, and not as a cause to think of her as a secondary writer. Sorry, there was somebody here. You were trying to... Yeah.
Well, it's really also listening to what you're saying. It's double standards that the older woman and the younger lover, that's still somehow you're saying is unacceptable. But the other way around, of course, it's fine. And I'm afraid I'm thinking this might be a bit controversial, but other huge... Well, first of all, a lot of writers are forgotten. There's a lot of women writers who've been forgotten. But, for example, there are great writers. They all had mad lives. I'm thinking of Romain Gary, who was a huge womanizer. His wife of 18 years, the first one, Leslie Blanche, the first one was Komisarjevsky before Gary, but she had an affair with Komisarjevsky's son. So, but she was hugely derided, and whereas the men, I'm making it rather black and white and simple, and I don't want this to sound anti-male, but there's double standards there, and all that sort of forgotten and brushed under the carpet. And also being derided for writing about very unfashionable things in the 50s, like Russians and Islamists. And that was completely... So, they're completely forgotten and swept under the carpet. But, I can think of quite a lot of other women like that as well, who... The Bloomsburys... Anyway, it's a big subject. But so you still think that these... Yes, I suppose it's still what your view is of what I've said. Sorry, I hope I've made sense.
So part of the radicalism of Colette would be precisely that reversal of the much more familiar pattern of the older man and the younger woman. And there are so many reversals that she operates, in fact, as well. For example, the concentration on the beautiful young male body, as opposed to solely objectifying young female bodies, which was also innovative, I think, the way she describes that. There's a question there. We can one more question. Yes, we need the...
Hello, thank you so much for your thoughts and your ideas on Colette. I just have a question. If, in the case, if you imagine she was here today and alive and she was listening to our conversations, what do you think would be her advice to young new writers like myself?
I think Michèle quoted from Colette right at the beginning, look longer at what displeases you than what pleases you. I'm not really sure I do that. And then that other quote, more mysterious, never touch a butterfly's wings with your fingertips. So that needs a little bit of translation, sort of what's that got to do with writing? Maybe it's got to do with a certain sort of keeping things light, whilst also giving them existential punch. You know, so you're just going to, you're not going to really hammer things home. In a way, that's how I would interpret all of that.
If I can add, maybe she would say to you what she said to the young Georges Simenon when he came to see her and he was 20 years old, and she said, "Oh, that's good, you just have to forget about literature. Just get rid of the literature in what you're writing, and it will be good."
And then I think we've already heard that you've got to get into that room or cafe or wherever you're working, because not everyone wants to work in a room anymore. Stick at it, stay with it, do the work. And she was a fantastic professional. You had to stay with
Hard
it,
worker,
which means having some aggression. And for lots of young women are brought up still to think aggression is very unfeminine. But if you're going to make a commitment to making art and sticking at it, you've got to acknowledge your own aggression. Hurrah.